The Wyoming wind howled like a wounded animal across the frozen plains, carrying with it the promise of another brutal storm. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight, blanketing the landscape in a suffocating white that stretched as far as the eye could see. The Crowley Ranch sat alone in this vast emptiness, a cluster of weathered buildings that seemed to huddle together against the relentless cold. Silas Crowley stood at the frost-covered window of his cabin, watching the gray sky darken with approaching evening, his calloused hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. At 38, he cut a solitary figure, tall and lean, with shoulders broadened by years of hard labor and eyes that held the weight of loss. His dark hair, streaked prematurely with silver at the temples, hadn't seen a barber's touch in months. The cabin was silent save for the crackling of the fire in the stone hearth. Everything about the place spoke of a life lived alone. A single plate on the rough-hewn table, one chair pulled close to the fire, a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. Yet there were ghosts here too, in the carefully preserved quilts folded in the cedar chest, in the delicate china teacups that sat untouched on the shelf, gathering dust like memories. Margaret had been dead 4 winters now. The typhoid had taken her quick, along with half the county that terrible autumn of 1879. Silas had buried her on the hill behind the house, beneath the lone cottonwood tree where she used to hang the washing. He'd made his vow that day. Standing in the bitter wind with dirt still clinging to his hands, he would not love again. His heart had room for only one woman, and she lay beneath the frozen earth. The storm was picking up force when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the wind. Silas set down his cup and listened. There it was again, barely audible above the howling gale. A knocking, weak but persistent, at his door. He hesitated. Visitors were rare enough in good weather. In a blizzard like this, they were unheard of. The nearest neighbor, old Sam Henderson, lived 8 miles east, and the town of Bitter Creek was a full day's ride. Whoever was out there was either lost or desperate, probably both. The knocking came again, more urgently now. Silas crossed to the door, lifted the heavy bar, and pulled it open. The figure that collapsed into his doorway was so covered in snow and ice that at first he couldn't tell if it was man or woman. Then he saw the tattered remains of a dress, the long dark hair crusted white with frost. A woman, barely conscious, her lips blue with cold. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracked and faint. Just for tonight?" Silas didn't think, he acted. Bending down, he lifted her slight form and carried her to the hearth. She weighed next to nothing, as if the storm had already stolen half of her away. He laid her on the braided rug before the fire and fetched the thick wool blanket from his bed. As the warmth began to work on her, he got his first real look at the stranger. She was young, perhaps 25 or 30, with a face that might have been pretty if not for the hollows beneath her cheekbones and the dark circles under her closed eyes. Her dress, once a respectable brown wool, was torn at the shoulder and hem. No coat, no gloves. How in God's name had she survived out there? Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of storm clouds. Fear flashed across her features as she took in her surroundings, her gaze darting from Silas to the door and back again. "You're safe," he said, keeping his voice low and steady, the way he'd talk to a spooked horse. "Name's Silas Crowley. This is my place. You're welcome to the fire." She struggled to sit up, wincing. I shouldn't be here. I only need to warm myself. Then I'll go." "Go where? There's nothing out there but death tonight." He moved to the stove, poured fresh coffee into a clean cup. "What's your name?" A long pause. "Miriam," she said finally, as if even that small truth cost her something. "Miriam Bennett." He handed her the coffee, noticed how her hands shook as she took it. "Well, Mrs. Bennett, you'll stay put until this storm passes. I won't have your death on my conscience." Something flickered in her eyes at the word Mrs. Pain, maybe, or shame. She clutched the blanket tighter around her shoulders. I have no money to pay for." I'm not asking for payment. The sharpness in his voice surprised them both. He softened his tone. Just common decency is all. Anyone would do the same. But even as he said it, Silas knew it wasn't entirely true. The good people of Bitter Creek might well have turned her away, especially a woman traveling alone in such weather, with that haunted look in her eyes. There was a story here, and likely not a happy one. As if reading his thoughts, Miriam drew back slightly. You don't know anything about me. I might be dangerous. Despite himself, Silas almost smiled. Ma'am, you can barely hold that cup. I think I'll take my chances. He busied himself with practical matters, heating a pot of beans and salt pork, finding an old shirt and pair of trousers that might serve better than her ruined dress. When he turned back, she had dozed off, her head tilted against the stone hearth, in sleep. The wariness left her face, and he could see how young she really was, too young to have such old eyes. The wind rattled the windows, and Silas added another log to the fire. He settled into his chair, meaning to keep watch, but found himself studying her face in the firelight. When was the last time another person had been in this cabin? Sam had come by last spring to help with the branding, but that hardly counted. This was different. He stopped that thought cold. No good could come of it. As the night wore on, Miriam began to toss in her sleep, murmuring words he couldn't quite catch. Then, clear as day, she cried out, "Thomas! No! Thomas! Please! The baby!" She woke with a gasp, eyes wild, hands clutching at empty air. It took her a moment to remember where she was, and when she did, the naked grief on her face was almost too private to witness. "Bad dream," she said unnecessarily, wrapping her arms around herself. Silas poured fresh coffee, giving her time to compose herself. "We all have them." "Do we?" Her laugh was bitter. "Do you dream of people you've failed, people you've lost?" "Every night," he said simply. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw recognition dawn in her eyes, the recognition of one grieving soul meeting another. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "How long?" 4 years. He didn't need to say more. They sat in companionable silence after that, watching the fire dance. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the small circle of warmth and light, something fragile and unexpected had taken root. When Miriam finally spoke again, her voice was steady. "I'll leave first thing when the storm breaks. You've been kind, Mr. Crowley, but I won't bring my troubles to your door." "Everyone's got troubles," Silas said. "And it's just Silas." She almost smiled. "Silas, then you're a good man. Your wife was lucky." He flinched at that, and she saw it. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have—" "Margaret," he said, surprising himself. "Her name was Margaret, and I was the lucky one." The fire popped and settled. Miriam pulled the blanket closer. "Thomas was my husband. He's been gone 6 months now. The baby—" She stopped, unable to continue. Silas didn't press. Some wounds were too fresh for words. As the night deepened, he made her a pallet near the fire, ignoring her protests. He took his bedroll to the far corner, giving her space and privacy, but sleep eluded him. He lay listening to her breathing, to the storm, to the voices of memory that whispered in the dark. He'd made a vow. He'd sworn on Margaret's grave that his heart was buried with her. But as he stared at the ceiling, listening to a stranger's quiet breathing, Silas felt something he'd thought dead forever, the faint, terrifying stirring of his heart beginning to thaw. Outside, the Wyoming winter raged on, indifferent to the small drama playing out in the isolated cabin. But inside, by the light of a dying fire, 2 broken people had found momentary shelter from more than just the storm. The morning light filtered weakly through the frost-covered windows, revealing a world transformed by the storm. Snow had drifted halfway up the door, and ice hung like prison bars from the eaves. Silas rose quietly, careful not to wake his unexpected guest, and stoked the fire back to life. He was measuring coffee into the pot when Miriam stirred. She sat up slowly, disoriented, then winced and grabbed at her right ankle. Morning, Silas said, not turning from the stove. Coffee'll be ready soon. I should go. She struggled to stand, then gasped and sank back down. My foot. Now he did turn, seeing her face pale with pain. Let me look. She drew back instinctively. It's nothing. I just need to... You need to sit still and let me help. His tone brooked no argument. Years of doctoring horses and cattle had given him a passable knowledge of injuries. May I? After a long hesitation, she nodded. Silas knelt and gently examined her ankle through the worn leather of her boot. Even that light touch made her bite her lip. It's swollen something fierce. We need to get this boot off. He looked up at her. It's going to hurt. I've known hurt, she said quietly, working as carefully as he could. Silas unlaced the boot and eased it off. Her ankle was purple and twice its normal size. Not broken, he thought, but badly sprained. She'd never make it a mile in this condition, let alone to wherever she'd been heading. You'll need to stay off this for a few days at least, he said, wrapping the ankle with strips torn from an old sheet. I can't stay here. There was desperation in her voice now. You don't understand. I have to... No, you have to heal, Silas interrupted. Unless you're aiming to lose some toes to frostbite, or worse. She looked toward the window, at the wall of white beyond. Her shoulders sagged in defeat. A few days, then, but I'll work for my keep. I can cook, mend. We'll sort that out later. He stood, brushing off his knees. Right now, you need food and rest. He busied himself with breakfast, flapjacks and bacon. Simple fare, but hot and filling. Miriam ate like she hadn't seen food in days. Which, Silas reflected, might well be true. When she'd finished, some color had returned to her cheeks. Thank you, she said. I haven't... It's been a while since anyone showed me kindness without wanting something in return. There was a story there, but Silas didn't push. Instead, he cleared the plates and said, I need to check on the animals. Will you be all right for a spell? She nodded, and he bundled into his coat and ventured into the storm. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving ice crystals into his exposed skin. He fought his way to the barn, where his horses and milk cow waited in the relative warmth. As he forked hay and broke ice from the water troughs, his mind kept returning to the woman in his cabin. Who was she running from? Or perhaps the better question was, what was she running from? A bad marriage ended badly, from the sounds of it, and a child lost. He knew that particular pain all too well. Margaret had been carrying when the fever took her. When he returned to the cabin, stamping snow from his boots, he found Miriam standing at the shelf, looking at Margaret's teacups. They're beautiful, she said without turning. Delicate, like they don't belong out here. They were my wife's, wedding gift from her mother back east. Miriam traced a finger along one painted rose. She must have been a lady. She was. Silas hung up his coat. Finer than anything I deserved. Don't! Her voice was sharp suddenly. Don't do that. Do what? She turned to face him, balanced awkwardly on one foot. Talk about yourself like you're worthless. Like you don't deserve good things. It's a dangerous habit to fall into. Their eyes met across the small space, and Silas saw she was speaking from hard experience. I'll keep that in mind, he said carefully. Now, you should sit before you fall. The day passed strangely. Silas was used to solitude, to long stretches where his only company was his own thoughts and the occasional lowing of cattle. But Miriam's presence changed the very air in the cabin. She insisted on helping despite her injury, mending a tear in his coat with tiny, perfect stitches while he worked on repairing a broken bridle. They talked, cautiously at first, then with growing ease. She told him she'd come from Kansas, heading west to California where she'd heard there was work for women in the boarding houses. He told her about the ranch, about the challenges of running cattle in this unforgiving land. Neither of them spoke of what had driven her into the storm, or what kept him alone on this isolated ranch. As afternoon faded toward evening, Silas noticed her shivering despite the fire's warmth. You're still chilled through, he said. There's a trunk of Margaret's things in the loft. Might be something warmer that would fit you. She looked uncomfortable. I couldn't. It wouldn't be right. They're just clothes, Silas said, though he knew it was more than that. No sense in them going to waste. He climbed to the loft and opened the trunk he'd barely touched in 4 years. Margaret's scent had long faded, but memory rushed over him nonetheless. Her blue Sunday dress, the apron she'd worn when making preserves, the shawl her sister had knitted. He selected a warm wool dress and a heavy shawl, closing the trunk quickly before the past could pull him under. Miriam accepted them gratefully, disappearing behind the blanket he'd strung up for privacy. When she emerged, Silas had to look away. The dress fit her well enough, and seeing another woman in Margaret's clothes was both wrong and strangely right. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll be careful with them." That evening, as they shared another simple meal, the lamplight caught the auburn highlights in Miriam's dark hair. She'd washed her face and tidied herself as best she could, and Silas found himself noticing things he shouldn't. The curve of her neck, the way her eyes crinkled slightly when she almost smiled. "You're staring," she said, not looking up from her plate. "Sorry, it's been a long time since I had company. Don't apologize. It's nice to be seen as something other than trouble walking." "Is that what you were? Trouble?" She set down her fork. "My husband thought so. Thomas was. He had dreams bigger than his sense. Thought he could make a fortune at the card tables. When that didn't work out, he blamed everyone but himself, especially me." Silas waited, letting the silence invite more if she wanted to share it. "He was drunk when it happened," she continued, voice barely above a whisper. "Got into a fight over a hand of cards. The other man had a knife." She touched her shoulder, where he'd noticed the dress was torn. "I tried to stop it. Tried to pull Thomas away, but he—" "It wasn't your fault," Silas said firmly. "Wasn't it? Everyone in town seemed to think otherwise. A woman who can't keep her man from drinking, who can't give him sons to settle him down. What good is she? That's fool talk." She smiled bitterly. "Maybe, but fools run the world, don't they? After Thomas died, his debts came calling. When I couldn't pay, they took the house. When I had nothing left to take, they decided I was bad luck, a curse on the town. The good ladies of Harper's Creek made it clear I wasn't welcome anymore. So you left. In the middle of the night, with what I could carry, which wasn't much, as you can see." She gestured at herself. "I thought I could make it to the next town before the storm hit. I was wrong about that, too." They sat in silence for a moment, the fire popping in the hearth. "What happened to the child?" Silas asked gently. Miriam's face crumpled. "Born too early, too small. The doctors said it was the upset, the fighting. But I know better. I couldn't even keep my baby safe inside me. What kind of mother does that make me?" Without thinking, Silas reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Her fingers were cold and trembling. "The kind who's grieving," he said. "The kind who's human." She looked at their joined hands, and he suddenly realized what he'd done. He started to pull away, but she turned her palm up and gripped his fingers. "Your hands," she said wonderingly. "They're so warm. I'd forgotten what warm felt like." They sat that way for a long moment, hands clasped across the rough table, two souls finding unexpected comfort in shared sorrow. Then Miriam gently extracted her hand and stood, wobbling slightly on her injured ankle. "I should rest," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Thank you for everything." Silas watched her make her way to the pallet by the fire. He banked the coals and retreated to his own corner. But sleep was a long time coming. He lay in the darkness, feeling the phantom warmth of her hand in his, and wondered what he'd gotten himself into. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song across the frozen plains. But inside the cabin, neither of them was quite as alone as they'd been that morning. The days that followed took on a rhythm neither of them had expected. The storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a world encased in crystalline white. But the cold remained brutal enough to make travel impossible for someone in Miriam's condition. Each morning, Silas would rise before dawn, tend to his animals, and return to find coffee brewing and breakfast started. Miriam had insisted on earning her keep despite his protests. "I won't be a burden," she'd said with that stubborn tilt to her chin he was coming to recognize. "I may be lame as a three-legged dog right now, but my hands work just fine." And work they did. The cabin hadn't been so clean since Margaret's time. Miriam mended every piece of clothing that showed wear, organized shelves that had descended into bachelor chaos, and cooked meals that reminded Silas what real food tasted like. But it was the small things that unsettled him most, the way she hummed softly while working, how the lamplight caught in her hair when she bent over her sewing, the gentle grace of her movements despite her injury. He found himself making excuses to stay in the cabin longer than necessary, fixing things that had waited months for repair. When he did escape to the barn, he'd catch himself hurrying through chores that usually gave him peace. "You're acting like a green boy," he muttered to his horse one afternoon, yanking the curry comb through the animal's mane with unnecessary force. The horse snorted and stamped, as if in agreement, but he couldn't help himself. Miriam drew him like a moth to flame, even as every rational part of his mind screamed warnings. She was passing through, running from a past that still haunted her eyes. He'd made a vow. This could only end in pain. On the fourth day, he came in from checking his cattle to find her standing at the window, weight balanced on her good foot, staring out at the endless white. "It's like the edge of the world," she said without turning. "As if nothing exists beyond what we can see." "Sometimes that's a comfort," Silas said, hanging up his coat. "And sometimes it's terrifying." She pressed her palm against the cold glass. "To think you could disappear out here and no one would ever know. No one would care. I'd know." The words hung between them. Miriam turned slowly, her gray eyes searching his face. "Would you?" she asked softly. "Would you really?" Silas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. "Yes." Something shifted in her expression, a wall crumbling, and suddenly the space between them seemed both too vast and not nearly vast enough. She took a limping step toward him, then stopped. "I should check the bread," she said, her voice unsteady. "Miriam, please." She held up a hand. "Don't. Just don't." That evening passed in awkward silence. They ate without speaking, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the ever-present whisper of wind against the walls. When Miriam retired early, pleading fatigue, Silas was almost relieved. He sat by the fire, nursing a cup of whiskey from the bottle he kept for medicinal purposes, and tried to make sense of what was happening. Margaret gazed at him from the tintype on the mantel, her serious young face frozen forever in sepia tones. "I'm sorry," he whispered to her image. "I'm so damn sorry." But Margaret's photographed eyes offered no absolution, no guidance. She was gone, had been gone for 4 long years, and he was still here, still breathing, still, God help him, still capable of wanting. A sound from across the room made him look up. Miriam was stirring in her sleep, murmuring words he couldn't make out. Then, as had happened before, her voice rose to a cry. "No, please, the baby! Thomas, no!" She thrashed against invisible demons, and without thinking, Silas crossed to her. He knelt beside the pallet, touching her shoulder gently. "Miriam, wake up. It's just a dream." Her eyes flew open, wild and unfocused. For a moment she didn't seem to recognize him, shrinking away from his touch. Then awareness returned, and with it, tears. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you." "Hush." He helped her sit up, keeping his touch careful and brotherly. "Nothing to be sorry for." She was shaking, arms wrapped around herself. "It's always the same dream. The blood, and Thomas laughing, and the baby." She broke off, choking on a sob. Silas fetched a cup of water and the blanket from his own bed, wrapping it around her shoulders. He should go back to his corner, he knew. Should maintain the careful distance that kept them both safe. Instead, he found himself sitting beside her on the floor. his back against the warm stones of the hearth. "Tell me," he said quietly. "Why?" Her voice was raw. "Why would you want to hear such ugliness? Because carrying it alone is killing you." She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, staring into the dying fire, she began to speak. "Thomas wasn't always cruel. When we first married, he was charming, full of grand plans. We were going to be rich. He said he just needed the right opportunity, the right hand of cards, but the opportunities never came, and the cards always turned against him. The drinking got worse. The anger got worse. When I told him about the baby, I hoped it would change things." She pulled the blanket tighter. "He was furious. Said we couldn't afford a brat. Said I'd done it on purpose to trap him. That night, he came home drunk from the saloon, raging about some man who'd cheated him. They'd fought. Thomas had a gun. The other man had a knife. I tried to get between them, tried to make peace, but Thomas, he shoved me. Hard. I fell against the table." Her hand moved unconsciously to her stomach. "The pain started that night. The doctor said it happened sometimes, that no one was to blame. But I knew, Thomas knew. The guilt made him worse. He'd look at me like I was a ghost haunting him, reminding him of what he'd done. The night he died, he was running from me as much as picking a fight with that man, and everyone knew it. The good wives of Harper's Creek. They all knew what kind of husband Thomas had been. What kind of wife would drive a man to such desperation? Stop." Silas's voice was rougher than he intended. "Just stop. None of that was your doing. Wasn't it? If I'd been a better wife, if I'd found a way to make him happy, he was a weak man who blamed others for his failures. That's not on you." She turned to look at him, tears tracking silver down her cheeks in the firelight. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I know what it is to carry guilt that's not yours to carry." The words came without his permission. "Margaret, my wife, she begged me to take her to town when she first took sick. Said the doctor there could help, but I was sure I could tend her myself. Sure it would pass. By the time I admitted I was wrong, she was too weak to make the journey. She died asking for her sister, and her sister was 3 states away." Miriam's hand found his in the darkness. "That's not the same as—" "Isn't it? We both made choices. We both lost people, but punishing ourselves won't bring them back." They sat in silence, hands linked, watching the embers pulse like heartbeats in the ash. The wind had died down outside, leaving a quiet so deep it seemed to have weight. "I dream about her," Silas admitted. "Margaret, she's always just out of reach, always walking away. I call to her, but she never turns around. Maybe that's her way of telling you to stop following," Miriam said softly. "Maybe she wants you to look ahead instead of back." He laughed, short and bitter. "To what? This?" He gestured at the cabin, the isolation, the empty life he'd built around his grief. "To whatever comes next." Her fingers tightened on his. "To tomorrow. To spring after winter. To whoever might need you now." Their eyes met and held. The air between them crackled with possibility and danger. Miriam lifted her free hand, hesitated, then touched his cheek. Her fingers were soft against his weathered skin, and he closed his eyes at the contact. "Miriam," he said, a warning, a plea. "I know," she whispered. "I know all the reasons why not, but I'm so tired of being cold. Silas, so tired of being alone." He opened his eyes to find her face inches from his. He could see the pulse beating in her throat, could feel her breath warm against his skin. Every instinct screamed at him to pull away, to remember his vow, to protect them both from this moment. Instead, he leaned in. Their lips met softly, tentatively, like two people remembering a language they'd forgotten they knew. Miriam made a small sound, surprise or surrender, and her hand slipped from his cheek to the back of his neck. Pulling him closer, the kiss deepened, and with it came a rush of feeling so intense it was almost pain. 4 years of numbness cracked apart like river ice in spring, and Silas was drowning, burning, coming alive in ways that terrified him. He pulled back abruptly, breathing hard. Miriam's eyes were wide, her lips parted. She looked as stunned as he felt. "I'm sorry," he said hoarsely. "I shouldn't have—" "Don't apologize." Her voice was fierce. "Don't you dare apologize for making me feel human again." She struggled to her feet, favoring her injured ankle, and limped toward the corner where she'd folded Margaret's clothes. Silas thought she was going to leave, to put distance between them. But instead, she turned back. "I won't be your guilt, Silas Crowley," she said. "And I won't be your betrayal, but I won't pretend that didn't mean something either." She disappeared behind the privacy blanket, leaving him alone by the dying fire. Silas sat there until the embers turned to ash, his fingers still burning from her touch, his heart at war with itself. Outside, clouds obscured the stars, and fresh snow began to fall. Winter wasn't done with them yet, and neither, he feared, were they done with each other. The morning after the kiss dawned cold and crystalline, with neither of them acknowledging what had passed between them in the firelight. They moved around each other like dancers afraid to touch, careful to maintain distance in the small cabin. Silas escaped to the barn early and stayed late. Miriam busied herself with tasks that didn't need doing, scrubbing pots already clean, reorganizing shelves already tidy. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. 3 days passed this way. On the 4th morning, Miriam set breakfast on the table with more force than necessary. "This is foolish," she announced. Silas looked up from his coffee, startled. "What is this pretending, acting like strangers when we've already—" She stopped, color rising in her cheeks. "My ankle is nearly healed. I should go." "Go where?" The words came out harsher than he intended. "You have no money, no proper clothes for traveling, and nowhere to go to." Her chin lifted. "That's not your concern." "The hell it isn't." He pushed back from the table, standing. "You think I'd just let you walk out into the snow with nothing? What kind of man do you think I am?" "I don't know." The words burst from her. "That's the problem. Don't you see? I don't know what you want from me. Silas, you save me, you shelter me, you kiss me like a drowning man seeking air, and then you act like I'm poison. I can't bear it." They stared at each other across the table, both breathing hard. The truth of her words hung between them, undeniable. "I made a vow," Silas said finally, his voice low. "When Margaret died, I swore—" "To what? To die with her? To turn yourself into a walking gravestone?" Miriam's eyes blazed. "She's gone, Silas, but you're still here. You don't understand." "Don't I?" She laughed, bitter and sharp. You think you're the only one who's lost someone? Who's made promises to the dead, but the dead don't need our promises. They need us to live." The cabin felt too small suddenly, the walls closing in. Silas grabbed his coat and headed for the door. "Running away won't change what's happening between us," Miriam called after him. He paused, hand on the door. "Nothing is happening between us." "Liar." The word followed him out into the snow. He spent the day riding the boundaries of his land, checking cattle that didn't need checking, mending fence that wasn't broken. But everywhere he went, Miriam's words haunted him. The dead don't need our promises. They need us to live. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the snow pink and gold, Silas found himself at the hill behind the cabin. Margaret's grave stood silent beneath the cottonwood, marked by a simple wooden cross he'd carved himself. He dismounted and stood before it, hat in his hands. "I don't know what to do, Maggie," he said to the marker. "I made you a promise, said my heart was yours alone, always. But there's this woman, and she's— God help me. When I look at her, I feel things I swore I'd never feel again." The wind whispered through the bare branches of the cottonwood. But if Margaret had any wisdom to offer, she kept it to herself. When he returned to the cabin as darkness fell, he could smell something burning before he even opened the door. Inside, he found Miriam at the stove, frantically trying to salvage what looked like a ruined roast. "I'm sorry," she said without turning. "I was distracted and—" "It's just food," he said quietly. She spun around, and he saw she'd been crying. I'm making a mess of everything. I should go, truly, before I ruin more than supper. No. The word came out more forcefully than he intended. No, you're not going anywhere. Why? Her voice was barely a whisper. Why do you want me to stay if you can't even bear to look at me? Silas set down his hat, ran his hands through his hair. Because when you're here, the cabin doesn't feel like a tomb. Because your humming in the morning is the best sound I've heard in 4 years. Because... He stopped, struggling for words. Because you make me remember I'm still alive, and that terrifies me more than anything. Miriam stood very still, tears tracking down her cheeks. It terrifies me too, she admitted. After Thomas, I swore I'd never let anyone close enough to hurt me again, but you make me want things I have no right to want. They stood there, the length of the room between them, both trembling on the edge of something irreversible. I can't promise you anything, Silas said roughly. I'm broken. Miriam, maybe too broken to ever be whole again. I'm not asking you to be whole. She took a step toward him, then another. I'm just asking you to try, to let yourself feel something besides grief, even if it's just for tonight. She was close enough now that he could see the flecks of blue in her gray eyes, could smell the lavender soap she'd used in her hair. His hands moved of their own accord, coming up to frame her face. This is wrong, he said, even as his thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone. Wrong for who? For Margaret, who loved you enough to want you happy, for Thomas, who never knew what love was, or for us, who've forgotten what it feels like to be warm. She rose on her toes, bringing her lips close to his. Please, Silas, I'm not asking for forever. I'm just asking for now. He was lost. The moment her lips touched his, the last of his resistance crumbled like sand. He pulled her against him, and she came willingly, her arms winding around his neck. This kiss was nothing like the tentative exploration of the nights before. It was desperate, hungry, full of need too long denied. When they broke apart, both were breathing raggedly. Miriam's eyes were dark, pupils blown wide. Silas, I know, he said hoarsely. God help me, I know. He lifted her in his arms, surprised again at how light she was, how fragile she felt despite the steel in her spine. She buried her face in his neck as he carried her to his bed, the bed he'd shared with Margaret, the bed that had been cold and empty for 4 long years. As he laid her down, a moment of sanity tried to assert itself. Miriam, we shouldn't... She silenced him with a finger to his lips. Shouldn't is for tomorrow. Tonight, just let us be 2 people who need each other. Can you do that? He looked down at her, hair spread across his pillow like dark water, eyes bright with unshed tears and something else. Hope, maybe, or just shared desperation. Whatever it was, it called to something deep within him, something he'd thought buried with Margaret on that windswept hill. Yes, he whispered, and surrendered to the inevitable. Later, much later, they lay entwined in the darkness, listening to each other breathe. The fire had died to embers, but neither felt the cold. Miriam's head rested on his chest, and Silas found himself stroking her hair, marveling at its softness. What are we doing? She asked softly. I don't know, he admitted. But right now, I don't care. She lifted her head to look at him. Will you hate me in the morning? Will you hate yourself? He considered the question honestly. Maybe, but not as much as I'd hate myself for letting you go without this. She laid her head back down. I should feel guilty, but I don't. Is that terrible of me? If it is, we're terrible together. They fell silent again. Outside, snow began to fall once more, soft and steady. The world beyond the cabin walls ceased to exist. There was only this room, this bed, these 2 damaged souls finding unexpected solace in each other's arms. Tell me about California, Silas said eventually. What were you hoping to find there? A new start. Somewhere no one knew my name or my history. Somewhere I could be just Miriam, not the widow Bennett, not the woman who drove her husband to drink and death. She traced patterns on his chest with one finger. Foolish dreams, not foolish, hopeful. Same thing, isn't it? No. He caught her hand, brought it to his lips. Hope takes courage. You've got plenty of that. Do I? Then why do I feel so afraid? Afraid of what? Of morning. Of you remembering your promise. Of having to leave and never seeing you again. Her voice broke on the last words. Silas pulled her closer. Morning's a long way off yet. But even as he said it, he knew she was right to be afraid. Morning would come, as it always did. And with it would come reality. Guilt. Consequences. The weight of promises made to the dead. But for now, in the darkness, with her warm weight against him and her breath soft on his skin, Silas let himself forget everything but this moment, this woman, this unexpected grace in the midst of winter. Tomorrow would come soon enough. Tonight, for the first time in 4 years, he wasn't alone, and neither was she. Dawn came with the cruel clarity that follows a night of reckoning. Silas woke to find the bed empty beside him, the sheets cold where Miriam had lain. For a moment, he wondered if he'd dreamed it all. The warmth, the whispered words, the feeling of being alive again. Then he heard quiet movement from the main room and knew it had been real. Too real. He dressed quickly and found her at the table, fully clothed in her own mended dress, her few possessions gathered in a worn cloth bundle. She didn't look up when he entered. Coffee's on the stove, she said quietly. Miriam, don't. Her voice was steady, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. Please don't. We both knew this morning would come. He poured coffee with hands that weren't quite steady, then sat across from her. In the harsh morning light, he could see the marks of sleeplessness under her eyes, the determined set of her jaw. Your ankle is healed enough. I've imposed on your kindness too long. Is that what you call it? Imposing? She finally looked at him then, and the pain in her eyes nearly undid him. What else can I call it? I came here a stranger, desperate and friendless. You saved my life, and I repaid that by making you break a sacred promise. You didn't make me do anything. Didn't I? She laughed, short and bitter. I knew you were grieving. I knew about your vow. But I was selfish. I wanted, God help me, I wanted to feel alive again, even if just for one night, and I used your loneliness against you. Stop it. His voice came out harsher than intended. You're not some temptress who led me astray. We're two grown people who found comfort in each other. There's no sin in that. Isn't there? She stood abruptly, clutching her bundle. Look me in the eye, Silas Crowley, and tell me you don't feel guilty. Tell me you won't go to your wife's grave the moment I leave and beg her forgiveness. He couldn't. They both knew it. I thought so. She moved toward the door, limping only slightly now. Thank you for everything. I mean that. You saved my life in more ways than one, but staying would only bring more pain to both of us. Where will you go? He stood too, desperate to keep her talking, to delay the inevitable. You have no money. No. I'll manage. I always have. At least let me. No. She turned at the door, and he saw tears she was fighting not to shed. Don't offer me money. Don't offer me supplies. Don't make this harder than it already is. Just let me keep my dignity. It's all I have left. They stood there, the width of the room between them, everything said and unsaid hanging in the air like smoke. Miriam, he said, and her name was a prayer, a plea. Goodbye, Silas. Be well. Be. She opened the door and stepped out into the brilliant morning. The snow had stopped, leaving the world pristine and glittering. He watched from the doorway as she made her way across the yard, her slight figure dark against all that white. She didn't look back. Not once. Silas stood there until she disappeared over the rise, heading toward town. Then he went back inside, closed the door, and surveyed his empty cabin. Everything was as it had been before she came, neat, orderly, lifeless. Only the faint scent of lavender soap and the memory of warmth testified that she'd ever been there at all. He lasted 2 hours. 2 hours of pacing, of trying to work and failing, of seeing her everywhere he looked. Then he was saddling his horse, filling saddlebags with supplies she'd been too proud to accept, counting out what money he could spare. The road to Bitter Creek showed her footprints clearly in the fresh snow. She was moving slowly, favoring her ankle more than she'd let on. He caught up to her 3 miles from the ranch, a small, determined figure trudging through the drifts. "Get on the horse," he called out. She didn't turn. "Go home, Silas. Not without you." Now she did turn, and he saw tears frozen on her cheeks. "Why are you doing this?" "Because letting you walk away would be the second biggest mistake of my life." He dismounted, leading the horse closer. "The first was letting you think last night meant nothing." "It has to mean nothing. You made a vow." "To a dead woman." The words tore from him, raw and painful. "I promised Margaret my heart would die with her. But hearts are treacherous things. Miriam, they don't stay buried just because we will them to." She swayed on her feet, and he caught her arms to steady her. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't give me hope just to take it away again. I'm not taking anything away. I'm trying to... God, I don't know what I'm trying to do. All I know is that watching you leave felt like dying all over again. And I'm tired of dying. Miriam, so damn tired." She searched his face, looking for something. Truth, maybe, or conviction. Whatever she found there made her shoulders slump in defeat or relief. "I can't go back to that cabin," she said. "Not to stay. It's her place, not mine. I won't be a ghost in another woman's home." He understood. "Then we'll go to town. Get you a room at the boarding house. Court proper like, if you'll let me. Figure out what this is between us without Margaret's memory watching over our shoulders. And if what we figure out is that last night was a mistake, that grief and loneliness make poor advisors, then at least we'll know." He touched her face gently, thumb brushing away a frozen tear. "But I don't think it was a mistake. I think maybe you walked into that storm for a reason. Maybe we both needed saving." She leaned into his touch for a moment, then straightened. "All right. But I pay my own way at the boarding house. I'll take work, earn my keep. I won't be any man's charity case ever again." "Fair enough." He helped her onto his horse, then swung up behind her. She sat stiffly at first, trying to maintain distance even in the confines of the saddle. But as they rode, she gradually relaxed against him, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder. "What will people say?" she asked as the buildings of Bitter Creek came into view. "A widow and a widower, keeping company so soon after. Let them say what they will. We know the truth of it." "Do we? What is the truth of it, Silas?" He was quiet for a long moment, feeling the weight of her against him, the tangle of guilt and hope in his chest. "The truth is that we're two people who've known loss, trying to find our way back to life. Everything else, we'll figure out as we go." The boarding house stood on Main Street, a respectable establishment run by Mrs. Ella Patterson, a widow herself who knew how to mind her own business. Silas paid for a week in advance, ignoring Miriam's protests. "Call it a loan," he said. "You can pay me back when you find work." Mrs. Patterson showed Miriam to a small but clean room on the second floor. When she came back down, Silas was waiting in the parlor, hat in his hands. "I'll call on you tomorrow," he said. "If that's acceptable." "It's acceptable." She looked around the tidy parlor with its lace curtains and proper furniture. This is right. Silas, better than..." "I know." They stood awkwardly, not touching, aware of Mrs. Patterson's curious gaze from the doorway. "Well then," Miriam said, "until tomorrow." Until tomorrow. He left her there, in that respectable boarding house with its rules and proprieties, and rode back to his empty cabin. But for the first time in 4 years, the emptiness didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like possibility. That night, he sat by the fire and talked to Margaret's photograph. "I don't know if you can forgive me," he said. "I don't know if I can forgive myself. But she's right. You wouldn't want me to die with you. You always said I was too stubborn to know what was good for me. Maybe she's what's good for me now." The photograph, as always, kept its silence. But somehow, The silence felt less like judgment and more like peace. In town, Miriam sat by her own window, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Tomorrow, Silas would call. Tomorrow, she'd have to face what they'd started, decide if she had the courage to see it through. But tonight, she allowed herself to hope. It was a dangerous thing. Hope. But after so long in the cold, even dangerous warmth was welcome. The future stretched before them, uncertain and fraught with challenges. There would be talk, of course. Judgment from those who thought they knew better. The ghosts of Thomas and Margaret would not be easily laid to rest. But for now, on this clear winter night, two wounded hearts began the slow, painful, necessary work of learning to beat again. Word traveled fast in Bitter Creek. By the time Silas arrived at the Mercantile the next morning, conversation stopped mid-sentence, and eyes followed him with barely concealed curiosity. He ignored them, purchasing coffee and flour with studied indifference, but he could feel the weight of their speculation. "Heard you brought in a woman yesterday," Jacob Muller, the store owner, said as he tallied the purchases. "Put her up at Patterson's place." "That's right," Silas said evenly. "Traveling alone, was she?" "That's her business, not yours." Muller's eyes narrowed. "Just being neighborly, Crowley. Town's gotta look after its own. Since when is being run out of your home for debts not your making something the town needs to look after?" The words came out sharper than intended. "So she's that kind of woman, is she? The kind that brings trouble?" Silas leaned across the counter. "The kind that deserves common decency. You'd do well to remember that." He left with his purchases, but the encounter set the tone for what was to come. When he called on Miriam that afternoon, Mrs. Patterson's welcome was noticeably cooler than the day before. "She's in the parlor," the boarding house keeper said stiffly. "Door stays open during visiting hours." Miriam sat by the window, wearing the same brown dress, now clean and carefully pressed. She looked up when he entered, and he saw the strain around her eyes. "You've heard?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Heard what?" "Mrs. Thompson from the dry goods store came by this morning. Very friendly, very curious. By the time she left, she knew my whole history, or at least the version of it that will be all over town by sunset." Miriam's hands twisted in her lap. "I told you this would happen. Let them talk. It'll blow over." "Will it?" She stood, moving to the window. "They're saying I'm a curse, that I drove my husband to drink and death, and now I've set my cap for you. Mrs. Thompson actually asked if I'd used feminine wiles to trap you." Despite the situation, Silas almost smiled. "What did you tell her?" "That my feminine wiles extended to nearly freezing to death on your doorstep." She didn't find it amusing. He crossed to her, careful to remain in full view of the open door. "I don't care what they say. You will. When your friends start avoiding you, when your business suffers, when they whisper behind your back everywhere you go, you'll care then." "Miriam, I found work," she interrupted. "At the saloon." The words hit him like cold water. "The saloon?" "Not what you're thinking," she said quickly. "Just cooking and cleaning. The owner, Mr. Daniels, needs someone to prepare meals for the card room. It's honest work. People will talk even more if you—" "People are already talking." She turned to face him, eyes blazing. "At least this way I can earn my keep. Pay you back. Save enough to move on." "Move on?" The words stuck in his throat. "I thought we agreed to see what this is between us." "Well, I've seen. It's real. Silas, real enough that staying will ruin you. I won't do that." Before he could respond, a commotion in the street drew their attention. Through the window, they could see a crowd gathering near the sheriff's office. Shouts carried on the cold air, though the words were indistinct. "What now?" Miriam murmured. "They found out soon enough?" "Mrs." Patterson burst into the parlor, propriety forgotten in her excitement. "There's been trouble at the Murphy Ranch. Cattle stolen. Murphy himself shot. They're forming a posse to track the thieves." Silas was already reaching for his coat. "How bad is Murphy?" "Bad enough. Doc's with him now." "Mrs." Patterson's eyes darted between them. "Sheriff wants every able-bodied man who can ride and shoot." "I'll get my horse," Silas said, then looked at Miriam. "I have to go." "I know." Her face had gone pale. "Be careful." He wanted to touch her, to offer some comfort, but not under Mrs. Patterson's eager gaze. "I'll come back," he said instead, "soon as I can." The posse formed quickly, a dozen men armed with rifles and determination. Sheriff Wade, a steady man in his 50s, laid out what they knew. The thieves had hit at dawn, making off with 30 head of prime beef. Murphy had tried to stop them and taken a bullet for his trouble. "Which way did they head?" someone asked. "North, toward the canyon country. Ground's frozen, but we've got tracks." Wade's eyes swept the group. "This is the third ranch hit this month. Time we put a stop to it." They rode out as the sun peaked overhead, following the clear trail left by the stolen cattle. Silas found himself paired with Sam Henderson, his nearest neighbor and closest thing to a friend. "Heard you got yourself tangled up with that Bennett woman," Sam said as they rode. "News travels fast. Faster when it's interesting. You know she's bad news, don't you? Woman like that, with her history." "What do you know of her history?" Silas kept his voice level. "Know she couldn't keep her man from the bottle? Know she got run out of Harper's Creek for causing trouble? Know she showed up at your place with nothing but the clothes on her back? And now you're sniffing around her like—" "Choose your next words careful." "Sam." The older man studied him. "Jesus, Silas, she's really got her hooks in you, hasn't she?" "It's not like that." "Then what's it like? You've been alone since Margaret died, steady as a rock. Now this woman shows up and suddenly you're paying for her room, defending her honor, acting like some lovesick boy. People are worried about you." People should mind their own business. They rode in silence after that, the easy camaraderie broken. The trail led them into rougher country, where wind-carved rocks created a maze of hiding places. Sheriff Wade called a halt as the sun began to sink. "Too dangerous to continue in the dark," he announced. "We'll camp here, pick up at first light." As they made camp, Silas found himself isolated. Conversations died when he approached, started up again when he moved away. The message was clear. His association with Miriam had already begun to cost him. He volunteered for first watch, preferring the honest cold to the chill of his neighbor's judgment. As he sat with his rifle across his knees, watching the stars emerge, he thought of Miriam alone in town, facing the same ostracism. Was she right? Was staying selfish, dooming them both to live as outcasts? A sound in the darkness snapped him to attention. He raised his rifle, peering into the shadows. "Who's there?" "Easy, Crowley." A figure emerged. Bill Daniels, owner of the saloon. "Just checking the perimeter." Daniels settled beside him, pulling out a flask. "Drink." "I'm on watch." "Suit yourself." Daniels took a pull, then said, "That woman you brought to town, she came to see me about work." Silas tensed. "And?" "Hired her. Good cook, from what I can tell, and Lord knows I need the help." He paused. "She's got spine. I'll give her that. Looked me right in the eye and said she wouldn't do nothing but cook and clean, no matter what folks might think. I appreciate you giving her a chance. Don't thank me yet. Having her there is going to be complicated. The good wives of Bitter Creek don't much like their menfolk frequenting an establishment that employs a woman like her. She's not a woman like that. I know that. You know that. Hell, maybe even she knows that. But the town's made up its mind." Daniels stood, capping his flask. "Just thought you should know what you're both in for." The next morning brought fresh snow and lost tracks. The posse spent hours casting about, trying to pick up the trail, but the thieves had vanished into the canyonlands like smoke. By noon, Sheriff Wade called off the search. "They're long gone," he said grimly. "Probably halfway to Montana by now." The ride back to town was subdued, the men frustrated by their failure. As they crested the last ridge before Bitter Creek, Silas saw smoke rising from the chimney of the saloon and wondered if Miriam was there. facing down the judgment of strangers with her chin high and her hands steady. He went there straight from the livery, not caring who saw. The lunch crowd had thinned, leaving only a few die-hard drinkers and card players. Miriam was in the kitchen, visible through the serving window, her hair pinned up and an apron around her waist. She looked up when he entered, and relief flooded her features before she could hide it. "You're back. Told you I would be. Any luck?" Trail went cold. He approached the window, lowering his voice. "How was your first day?" "Educational." Her smile was rueful. "I've been called names I didn't even know existed, but Mr. Daniels has been decent, and the work is honest." "Miriam, don't." She glanced around, then leaned closer. "Not here. Too many years." He understood. "When do you finish?" 6, but you shouldn't walk me back. It'll only make things worse." "I'll be here at 6, he said firmly, true to his word. He was waiting when she emerged, tired but with her head high. They walked through the twilight streets, aware of curtains twitching and faces in windows. "This isn't sustainable," she said quietly. "You know that. What I know is that I'm tired of caring what narrow-minded fools think. Easy to say now, harder when you've lost everything because of it." They'd reached the boarding house. On the porch, in full view of the street, Miriam turned to face him. "I'm going to save every penny I earn. When I have enough, I'm leaving. It's the only solution that doesn't destroy us both." "Is that what you want? To leave?" Her composure finally cracked. "What I want doesn't matter. What I want is impossible. Tell me anyway." She looked up at him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I want to wake up next to you without shame. I want to walk down the street holding your arm without people spitting at our feet. I want a life that doesn't require choosing between love and survival. But we don't always get what we want, do we?" Before he could answer, she was gone, the door closing firmly behind her. Silas stood on the porch, hands clenched at his sides, fighting the urge to follow her, to promise things he wasn't sure he could deliver. The next weeks would test them both. He knew. The town had rendered its judgment, and neither of them would escape unscathed. But as he walked home through the cold night, Silas found himself thinking not of what they stood to lose, but of what they might yet find the courage to claim. Spring came slowly to Wyoming that year, fighting winter for every inch of ground. The snow retreated grudgingly, revealing brown grass that would soon green under the strengthening sun. On the Crowley Ranch, life stirred with the season. New calves in the pasture, hawks returning to nest in the cottonwoods, the earth softening enough to think about planting. Silas and Miriam had found a rhythm of sorts through the hard months. He would come to town twice a week, ostensibly for supplies, but really to see her. They would walk, always in public view, always proper. She remained at the boarding house, working at the saloon, saving every penny. Neither spoke of the future anymore. It was too painful, too uncertain. The town had not softened toward them. If anything, the whispers had grown louder, the speculation more vicious. Miriam bore it with quiet dignity, but Silas could see the toll it took in the shadows under her eyes, the way her hands sometimes trembled when she thought no one was looking. It was on a mild April morning that everything changed. Silas had just finished checking on a sick calf when he saw a rider approaching the ranch. As the figure drew closer, his gut tightened with foreboding. The man wore a badge and the dust of hard travel. "Silas Crowley?" the man asked, not dismounting. "That's me, Deputy Marshal Frank Morrison, out of Cheyenne." He produced a folded paper from his coat. "Looking for a woman named Miriam Bennett. Understood she might be in these parts." Silas kept his face neutral. "What's your business with her?" "Official business. There's questions need answering about her husband's death. Some new information's come to light." Morrison's eyes were sharp, assessing. "You know where I might find her?" "Couldn't say." "Couldn't or won't." The marshal leaned forward in his saddle. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Crowley, I know she's been staying in town, working at the saloon. Just want to talk to her, is all." Then I suggest you try the saloon. Morrison studied him for a long moment, then touched his hat. I'll do that. Good day to you. Silas waited until the marshal was out of sight, then saddled his horse and rode hard for town, taking the back trails he knew better than any lawman could. He reached the saloon just as the lunch crowd was gathering, slipping in through the kitchen entrance. Miriam looked up from the stove, surprise flickering across her features. Silas, what are you— There's a marshal in town looking for you. Questions about Thomas. The color drained from her face. She gripped the counter for support. How did they find me? Does it matter? Get your things. We need to leave. She shook her head. No, Silas, this is my trouble, not yours. Don't be a fool. Whatever this is about. The front door of the saloon banged open, and Deputy Marshal Morrison's voice carried clearly. Looking for Miriam Bennett. Understand she works here. Miriam straightened, smoothing her apron with hands that barely shook. It's all right. I've done nothing wrong. I'll talk to him. Miriam? No. Her voice was firm. Running will only make it worse. I've run enough. She walked out of the kitchen, head high, and Silas followed despite her protests. The saloon had gone quiet, all eyes on the drama unfolding. I'm Miriam Bennett, she said clearly. Morrison touched his hat. Ma'am, need you to come with me. Some questions about your late husband's death. Am I under arrest? Not yet, but I've got a witness says you were more involved in that fight than you let on. Says maybe Thomas Bennett didn't die from the other man's knife after all. A murmur ran through the crowd. Miriam's chin lifted. That's a lie. Maybe so. But Judge Carter wants to hear all sides. You can come willing, or I can arrest you now. Your choice. Silas stepped forward. She's not going anywhere with you. Morrison's hand moved to his gun. Sir, I'd advise you not to interfere with federal business. It's all right, Miriam said quietly, putting a hand on Silas's arm. I'll go. The truth will out, as it always does. Miriam, no. Let me wire for a lawyer. With what money? She smiled sadly. No, this was always going to catch up with me. Better to face it now. She turned back to Morrison. I'll need to gather my things from the boarding house. I'll escort you. The walk through town was a spectacle. People emerged from shops and homes to watch Miriam Bennett being led away by a federal marshal. Some faces showed satisfaction, others curiosity, a few, very few, sympathy. At the boarding house, Mrs. Patterson could barely contain her outrage. I knew it. I knew she was trouble. A murderess. Under my roof. I'm no murderess, Miriam said with quiet dignity. Though I thank you for your hospitality these past months. She packed quickly, efficiently. When she emerged with her small bundle, Silas was waiting with a wagon. If you're taking her to Cheyenne, she rides with me, he told Morrison. The marshal shrugged. Suit yourself, but she's my responsibility. Try anything foolish. I'm not a fool, Silas said. Just a man who won't see a woman travel 3 days with a stranger when there's another option. The journey to Cheyenne was subdued. Morrison rode alongside the wagon, watchful but not unkind. At night, they made camp, and he was careful to treat Miriam with respect, even as he kept her under guard. On the second night, as they sat around the campfire, Miriam finally spoke of that night in Harper's Creek. Thomas was drunk, as usual. He'd lost badly at cards, accused the other man of cheating. They went outside to settle it. She stared into the flames. I followed, tried to stop them. Thomas pushed me aside, hard. I fell, hit my head on the horse trough. When I came to, Thomas was on the ground, blood everywhere. The other man was gone. That's not what Josiah Hartley says, Morrison interjected. He claims he saw you push your husband into the knife. Josiah Hartley? Miriam laughed bitterly. The magistrate who made unwelcome advances after Thomas died, who said I could pay my husband's debts in other ways, that Josiah Hartley? Morrison's expression shifted. He didn't mention any of that. No, I imagine he didn't. Silas's hands clenched on the reins. Is that why you ran? Because he— Because he made it clear that if I didn't submit to him, he'd see me hanged for Thomas's death. Said he had witnesses who'd swear to whatever he told them to. Miriam's voice was steady, but tears tracked down her cheeks. So yes, I ran, like a coward. Like a woman with no other choice, Silas corrected firmly. They reached Cheyenne on the third day. The city seemed impossibly large and loud after the quiet of Bitter Creek. Morrison escorted them to a boarding house near the courthouse. Trial set for next week, he informed them. You'll need to stay in town until then. I'll post a guard, but... He looked at Miriam directly. I believe there's more to this story than Hartley told. I'll be doing some investigating of my own. The week that followed was a blur of lawyers and preparations. Silas hired the best attorney he could afford, ignoring Miriam's protests about the cost. Slowly, the truth began to emerge. Other women came forward, quietly, to speak of Hartley's abuse of power. The man who'd actually killed Thomas was found in a Denver jail, willing to testify that Miriam had tried to stop the fight, not encourage it. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Word had traveled fast. A woman accused of murdering her husband, a prominent magistrate as the key witness. It had all the elements of a sensation. Miriam sat straight-backed in the defendant's chair, wearing the best dress the lawyer had been able to procure. When asked to tell her story, she did so clearly, without embellishment or tears. She spoke of Thomas's drinking, his gambling, his anger. She spoke of the night he died, of Hartley's threats after, of her desperate flight. When Hartley took the stand, his story began to unravel almost immediately. Faced with the testimony of others, with inconsistencies in his own account, he grew flustered, angry. Finally, when confronted with sworn statements from 3 other women about his conduct, he broke down entirely. She led him on, he shouted. Made him think she was available, then refused honest advances. Women like her... That's enough, the judge said sharply. I've heard enough. The verdict came quickly. Not guilty. More than that, the judge recommended that Hartley be investigated for corruption and abuse of power. As they left the courthouse, Miriam seemed dazed. It's over, she kept saying. It's really over. Yes, Silas said, taking her arm. It's over. They stood on the courthouse steps, spring sun warm on their faces, crowds milling around them. For the first time since that night in his cabin, the future seemed possible. What now? Miriam asked softly. Silas turned to face her fully, not caring who saw. Now I ask you a question I should have asked months ago. He dropped to one knee, right there on the courthouse steps. Miriam Bennett, will you marry me? A gasp went through the crowd. Miriam's hands flew to her mouth. I know it's not conventional. Silas continued. I know people will talk, but I'm done living my life by other people's rules. I'm done pretending I don't love you. You walked into my life in a snowstorm and brought spring with you. Marry me, not because you need protection, not because it's proper, but because I can't imagine a life without you in it. Tears were streaming down her face now. Silas, get up. People are staring. Let them stare. I'm not moving until you answer. She laughed through her tears, a sound of pure joy. Yes, you impossible man. Yes, I'll marry you. He stood then and kissed her there in front of God and Cheyenne and everyone. The crowd erupted, some in scandal, some in delight. But neither Silas nor Miriam heard them. They were married 3 days later in a small church, with Deputy Marshal Morrison and the lawyer as witnesses. It wasn't the wedding either had imagined in their youth, but it was theirs, and that was enough. As they prepared to leave for home, what a word that was now, Morrison pulled Silas aside. Take care of her, he said. She's been through enough. I intend to... And Crowley, that ranch of yours is pretty isolated. Might be folks in Bitter Creek won't take kindly to this news. If you need help, we'll manage. Silas said, We've faced worse than small-minded neighbors. The journey home was different from the journey out, where before there had been fear and uncertainty. Now there was quiet joy. Miriam wore her new wedding ring, A simple band Silas had found in Cheyenne, and couldn't stop looking at it. "It's real," she said wonderingly. "We really did it." Having second thoughts? "Never." She leaned against him on the wagon seat. "Though I do wonder what reception we'll get in Bitter Creek." "Does it matter?" She considered this. "No," she said finally. "It doesn't." As they crested the ridge above the ranch, the setting sun painted the valley in shades of gold and rose. The cabin sat waiting, smoke rising from the chimney where Silas had banked the fire before leaving. "Welcome home, Mrs. Crowley," he said. Miriam smiled, and in that smile was everything: gratitude, love, hope, and the promise of all the springs to come. "Home," she repeated. "Yes, that's what this is now. Home." The news of their marriage reached Bitter Creek before they did. By the time Silas and Miriam rolled into town for supplies 2 days later, the entire population seemed to be watching from doorways and windows. Some faces showed surprise, others disapproval, but a few, like Bill Daniels from the saloon and Doc Harmon, offered genuine smiles and congratulations. "Well, I'll be damned," Daniels said, pumping Silas's hand. "You actually did it. Good for you, Crowley, both of you." But not everyone was so accepting. As they loaded supplies at Muller's store, Mrs. Thompson swept past with her skirts held high, as if avoiding contamination. "Shameful," she hissed, loud enough to be heard. "Absolutely shameful. That poor Margaret, barely cold in her grave." Miriam's face flushed, but Silas placed a steady hand on her back. "4 years, Mrs. Thompson," he said calmly. "Margaret's been gone 4 years. Even the Bible says there's a time to mourn and a time to dance." "Don't you quote scripture at me, Silas Crowley. Not when you're living in sin with that." "My wife," Silas interrupted, his voice carrying across the store. "You're speaking of my wife, and I'll thank you to remember that." The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Miriam held herself carefully, as if the wrong movement might shatter something fragile. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "This is what I was afraid of. Your reputation." "To hell with my reputation." He pulled the wagon to a stop, turning to face her fully. "Listen to me. Miriam Crowley. Yes, Crowley. You're my wife now, before God and law. I don't give a damn what bitter old biddies like Mrs. Thompson think. The only opinion that matters to me is yours." She searched his face, then slowly smiled. "Have I told you today that I love you?" "Not in the last hour." "Then I'm remiss. I love you, Silas Crowley. Stubborn, impossible man that you are." They were still learning to live together, to be married. The cabin that had seemed so empty now felt almost too full, charged with their awareness of each other. Miriam had quietly packed away Margaret's things, not throwing them out, but storing them respectfully in the loft, in their place. She'd added her own touches: wildflowers in a mason jar, new curtains she'd sewn from fabric bought in Cheyenne, a colorful rag rug by the hearth. But it was the small intimacies that marked the real change. The way Silas would come up behind her while she cooked, wrapping his arms around her waist. How Miriam would smooth his hair back from his forehead when he dozed in his chair after a hard day's work. The comfortable silences, the shared laughter, the nights when words weren't necessary at all. 3 weeks after their return, on a warm May morning, Miriam woke feeling queasy. She barely made it outside before being sick, then stood in the dawn light, one hand on her stomach, the other gripping the doorframe. "Miriam?" Silas appeared behind her, concern creasing his features. "Are you ill?" She turned slowly, and he saw wonder mixed with fear in her eyes. "I don't think it's illness," she said softly. Understanding dawned on his face. "You mean?" "I think so. It's early yet, but—" She touched her stomach again, protective already. How do you feel about it?" For answer, he crossed to her in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet. "How do I feel? Like spring has truly come at last." She laughed, but when he set her down, her expression sobered. I'm frightened, she admitted. After what happened before, that wasn't your fault. You know that. Knowing and believing are different things. She leaned into him. What if I lose this one too? Then we'll grieve together and try again. But Miriam, this is different. You're safe now. Cared for. Loved. This child, our child, will be born into peace, not chaos. As spring deepened towards summer, Miriam bloomed with her pregnancy. The sickness passed, replaced by a glow that made her beautiful in new ways. Silas found himself watching her constantly, marveling at the miracle of life growing within her. The ranch thrived too. The calves grew strong. The garden Miriam planted flourished, and even the most suspicious neighbors had to admit that the Crowley place had never looked better. Sam Henderson was the first to thaw, bringing his wife to visit on a Sunday afternoon. I owe you an apology, he told Silas while the women talked in the house. I judged too quick. You're Miriam. She's good people. Yes, Silas agreed simply. She is. Slowly, others followed. Not everyone. Mrs. Thompson and her circle remained righteously indignant, but enough that Miriam could go to town without facing only hostility. It was Doc Harmon who brought the news that changed everything. He came to check on Miriam in her 6th month, pronouncing her healthy as could be. As he packed his bag, he mentioned casually, "Heard from the Marshal Service yesterday? That Hartley fellow from Harper's Creek. He's been convicted. Abuse of power, extortion, assault. He'll be spending the next 10 years breaking rocks." Miriam sank into a chair, one hand over her heart. Truly. Truly. And there's more. The town council of Harper's Creek sent a formal apology for how you were treated. Seems Hartley had his hooks in deep there, intimidating anyone who might have stood up for you. The doctor's eyes twinkled. They also sent this. He produced an envelope. Inside was a bank draft, Thomas's debts cleared, plus compensation for the property seized. I don't understand, Miriam said faintly. Justice, Mrs. Crowley. Sometimes it comes late, but it does come. After the doctor left, Miriam sat staring at the bank draft. It's enough to buy more land, she said. Expand the herd. Build a proper barn. Is that what you want? She looked up at him, eyes bright. I want to build something lasting, something our children can be proud of. Is that foolish? No, Silas said, kneeling beside her chair. That's exactly what we'll do. Summer brought long days and hard work. Together, they hired hands to help with the construction. Raising a barn that was the envy of the county, the ranch expanded, taking on new life just as Miriam grew rounder with their child. On a golden September afternoon, as Miriam rested on the porch Silas had built for her, she felt the first pains. He was in the far pasture, but somehow, call it intuition or providence, he knew. He rode hard for the house, arriving just as her face contorted with a stronger contraction. It's time, she gasped. The baby's coming. The ride to town had never seemed longer. Doc Harmon met them at his office, calm and competent. First babies take their time, he assured them. We've got ours yet. He was wrong. This baby was in a hurry to meet the world. As the sun set over Bitter Creek, painting the sky in the shades of rose and gold, a lusty cry announced the arrival of the newest Crowley. A daughter, Doc Harmon announced, placing the squalling bundle in Miriam's arms. Healthy and perfect. Miriam wept as she held her daughter, counting tiny fingers and toes. She's beautiful, she whispered. Oh, Silas, look what we made. Silas could barely see through his own tears. The baby was indeed perfect, a shock of dark hair like her mother's, unfocused eyes that would surely be gray, tiny fists waving in indignation at the bright new world. What shall we call her? Miriam asked. Silas thought of spring after winter, of hope after despair, of love finding a way through the impossible. Grace, he said. Grace Margaret Crowley. Miriam smiled. Yes, that's perfect. As word spread of the birth, an unexpected thing happened. The women of Bitter Creek, even some who'd been coldest to Miriam, began arriving with gifts, Baby blankets, tiny gowns, advice, and offers of help. Mrs. Henderson stayed a week, teaching Miriam the mysteries of motherhood. Even Mrs. Thompson sent a beautifully embroidered christening gown, though she didn't visit in person. Babies change things. Mrs. Henderson explained. Hard to hold on to grudges when there's new life to celebrate. That Christmas was unlike any the ranch had seen. The house was full of warmth and laughter, baby sounds and hope, as snow fell softly outside. Silas sat by the fire with Grace in his arms while Miriam prepared their feast. He thought of that night a year ago when a desperate woman had stumbled to his door, bringing spring disguised as winter. "What are you thinking?" Miriam asked, coming to sit beside him. "About miracles," he said. "About how the best things come when we least expect them." She leaned her head on his shoulder, watching their daughter sleep. "I was so broken when I came here," she said softly. "I thought I'd never be whole again. And now? Now I know broken things can be mended. That spring always follows winter. That love." She lifted her head to look at him. "That love is stronger than death, stronger than fear, stronger than all the judgment in the world." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white. But inside the Crowley house, there was warmth and light and the promise of all the seasons to come. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest, replaced by the living hope of the future. In her father's arms, Grace stirred and cooed, as if agreeing with her mother's words. And in that moment, with his wife beside him and his daughter in his arms, Silas knew that the vow he'd made at Margaret's grave had been fulfilled in ways he'd never imagined. He'd promised his heart would die with her. Instead, it had learned to live again, to grow large enough to hold new love without diminishing the old. Spring had come to stay at the Crowley Ranch, and with it, the endless possibility of joy. Thank you all for listening to this tale of love and redemption in the Wild West. We'd love to hear where you're enjoying this story from, whether you're listening during your commute, relaxing at home, or perhaps even somewhere out in the wide open spaces that our characters called home. Please subscribe to our channel From Wild West and share your thoughts about Silas and Miriam's journey in the comments below. Did their love story touch your heart? We can't wait to hear from you and share more tales of the American frontier.